Hello everyone, I will be explaining the volume 1 chapter 1 to 4 of the book An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation by Jeremy Bentham. Let's first start with the introduction. Who was Jeremy Bentham? Bentham was an English philosopher best known for being the foundational figure of utilitarianism. He was an advocate for social reforms and influenced various areas including legal reforms, animal rights and abolition of slavery. Now, in this book, in chapter number 1, which particularly stated principles of utility, Bentham explained that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They govern us in all we do and all we say and all we think, and every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but demonstrate and confirm it. In other words, it's not a subjection choice to base moral behavior on perception of pleasure and pain. Instead, we are compelled to do so. So, when talking about utility, it is the property of any object to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. Actions that would adhere to the principle of utility will seek the interest of community, as according to Bentham, the interest of the community is the sum of the interest of the several members who compose it. Bentham also states that if an action or measure of government confirms the principle of utility, one may always say either that the action is one that ought to be done or at least it is not one that ought to be done. In addition to this, Bentham stated that on most occasions we tend to accept or embrace this principle or standard without even thinking of it. At the same time, not many have been disposed to embrace it purely and without reserve, and even a few quarrels with it, either dining fully in it. However, contrary, Bentham stated that these reasons raised against the principle of utility do not prove that the principle is wrong, either it is misapplied. Now, to disapprove the arguments against the principle of utility, Bentham suggested steps to help a man come in terms with the principle of utility. Chapter 2 of Principle adverse to that of utility. So, Bentham tried to establish or put forward the principle of utility by proving other principles wrong. These principles are the principles of asceticism and the principle of sympathy and antipathy. So, let's start with the principle of asceticism. The key idea is that you have to remember for the principle is that it is always and completely opposed to the principle of utility. According to Bentham, someone who advised the principle of utility will try to achieve the greater good for the greater number, whereas here a supporter of the principle will want the act that bring the least happiness or pleasure for the greatest number. Asceticism can be defined as synonymous to frugality and self-denial under the principle. Some people believe that pleasure by itself is a bad thing and that pain is good. Say, if you are upset, you tend to deprive yourself of pleasure. Now, this principle is embraced by two classes of men of very different complexion. First one is immoralist and the other is religionist. Moralists are motivated by hope or the prospect of pleasure. They have hope of the honor and reputation at the hands of men. They make pain a matter of indifference, and usually men of education are frequently found under this category because the principle of asceticism is more suited to the elevation of their sentiment. On the other hand, religionists are motivated by fear of the prospect of pain. They have fear of future punishment at the hands of revengeful deity. They made it a matter of merit and of duty to court pain. An example of religionist would be Buddhist monk who believe that material possessions and status only result in greed or overindulgence, unfulfilled desires and suffering. So, if you rely on material things and status for happiness, then you will never be satisfied for happiness. This led ascetics to conclude that all pleasures at all it's a pain, so they deprive themselves of worldly or bodily pleasures by fasting, etc. These religionists look forward to a greater pleasure or other worldly reward such as reaching nirvana, but Bentham argued that this is just the principle of utility misapplied because they are still aiming to create a greater balance of pleasure over pain. It's just that their idea of rewards or pleasures are otherworldly. At an extreme, Bentham says that religionists are the worst kind, especially when they believe that this is their duty to make others miserable. It can sometimes see this with some religious preachers who romanticizes poor people or being poor. They say that less possession you have, the less evil you will be, and therefore the closer God is to you. Other examples are the holy wars and persecutions and torture of heretics made under the name of religion. Now, Bentham says that these two classes of men would naturally intermingle in so much that a man would not always know by which of them he was most influenced. Now next is the principle of sympathy and antipathy. When we say sympathy, it is how you feel for the other person. For example, if someone is going through a hard time, you sympathize with them. You feel sorrow and sorry for their misfortune. Antipathy, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. So, it's a feeling of hostility or dislike. So now, in this principle, you look at an action making moral discussions based on personal feelings, only it disregards external grounds or evidence, and since our feelings are not objective, our assessments and punishments, fear, actions are arbitrary and can be unjust, it should be not surprised that this principle is not a good basis for morals or legislation. This principle makes criminal punishment arbitrary and unjust. It should be no surprise that this principle is not a good basis for morals or legislations. Let's discuss the theological principle at the same time. When Bentham was writing his book, religion was intrinsically tied to morality, so he had to discuss it. Bentham explained that this is not really a principle because it just boils down to other things. This principle aims to represent the will of God. Furthermore, this principle also includes the pleasure and pain of faith. Now, chapter 3 of the four sanctions or sources of pain and pleasure. According to Bentham, middle of four sanctions or sources of pain and pleasure, namely physical, political, moral and religious. First, let's talk about physical sanctions. They are pain and pleasure that are purely natural. There is no interference from a divine being or a god and simply comes from the ordinary course of nature. Next is political sanction, which are sanctions that are administered by people, can be a group of people in a community or an individual from the community whose role is equivalent to that of a judge. The third sanction or source of pain and pleasure is called moral sanction, which is one that is administered by what Bentham calls as transperson in the community. In moral sanctions, the general public does not use any formal law as their basis for administering the pain and pleasure, uses their own spontaneous disposition. Last but not the least is the religious sanctions, which is pain and pleasure that directly comes from the hands of a superior or divine being. Next, religious sanctions. The first three sanctions is that the pain and pleasure can occur both in the present or future life. The difference between these four sanctions lies in the circumstances that accompany their production. If the pain is caused by an accident, it is considered as calamity. If the suffering is due to one's own negligence, it is considered as physical sanction. If the suffering is according with the law, then considered as political sanction. If the suffering is caused by the lack of assistance from others because they disapprove of the sufferer's actions. Lastly, religious sanctions, if your suffering is caused by an act of God's displeasure. Out of all these sanctions, Bentham states that physical sanctions is the basis of the rest of the source of pain and pleasure. Now, chapter 4, value of a lot of pleasure and pain and how to be measured. Let us discuss how we can measure the value of pleasure and pain. So, according to Bentham, the value of pleasure, pain for an individual for one event is determined by four attributes of the event: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity. Bentham elaborates on how to assess the moral worth of action based on their consequences. He asserts that action should be judged by their ability to increase pleasure or happiness and to minimize pain or suffering. This consequentialist approach emphasizes the importance of outcomes rather than intent. Moreover, Bentham stresses the need for a systematic approach to evaluate laws and social policies, arguing that laws should be crafted to promote public good.